Emily opened her eyes to the sound of absolute silence. It wasn't the gentle quiet of early morning, nor the stillness that comes with peace. No, this was something deeper, unnerving. The city, the place she had lived for nearly half her life, was devoid of noise. She sat up in bed, her heart racing as her mind scrambled to make sense of the silence. The hum of the city, the bustle of people, the distant sounds of traffic, all of it had disappeared. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and padded to the window. The view was as it had always been, skyscrapers reaching up to the sky, streets filled with the occasional car. But now, it was different. There was no movement, no people walking along the sidewalks, no cars rushing by. Not even the chirp of a bird. The city was a ghost town. Panic set in, her breath shallow as she opened the window, hoping for some sign of life. She called out, but there was no reply. No distant voices, no sound of children playing, no one. Just the wind, cold and sharp, rustling the leaves in the trees below. Where was everyone? The silence grew louder. It pressed on her chest, a weight too heavy to bear. She stepped into the hallway, calling out again, but there was no response. The empty echo of her voice was the only thing that greeted her. Emily's phone sat on the kitchen counter, untouched. She grabbed it, expecting to find dozens of missed calls, text messages, something to explain this sudden void. But when she unlocked it, there was nothing. No new messages, no notifications, just a blank screen. Her heart thudded in her chest as she frantically scrolled through her contacts, dialing her mother, her best friend, her coworkers. Nothing. She checked her email, hoping to find some kind of update or explanation. Again, there was nothing. She grabbed her jacket and headed for the door, her mind reeling. What was happening? Was this some kind of disaster, an emergency? Surely, people couldn't just vanish overnight. The streets outside were just as empty as her apartment. She walked briskly, eyes scanning every corner for any sign of life. Shops stood dark, their windows reflecting her lonely image. She reached the intersection, where she would normally see crowds of people rushing to work, and stopped dead in her tracks. The street was empty. Not a single person in sight. Not even a cyclist. Her breath caught in her throat as the full weight of the situation settled on her. This wasn't just a quiet morning. Something had happened. The city, once alive with voices, energy, and movement, was now a shell of its former self. And she was alone. A sharp chill ran down her spine, but it wasn't just the cold air. She had the eerie feeling of being watched, though no one was around. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she turned down the next street, hoping to find someone, anyone. She called out, but her voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness. She was alone in the world. Then, as she walked further, she saw it, a figure in the distance. A man. Standing still in the middle of the street, facing her. At first, she thought it was an illusion, a mirage created by her mind. But as she drew closer, the man remained. He was tall, wearing a worn leather jacket, his features obscured by the distance. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Was he real? How could he be here? Why was he alone? She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. She had been so consumed by the silence, the loneliness, that she hadn't considered that anyone else might be alive. But here he was. Someone who, like her, had survived whatever had caused the city to fall silent. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. The man didn't respond. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on the ground, his face hidden in shadow. Emily felt a strange pull, an instinctive need to approach him. There was no one else. He was the only other person she had seen, and she needed to know why. She needed to know if he had the answers to what had happened to everyone. As she took a cautious step toward him, she noticed something odd. He was standing in the exact middle of the street, almost as if waiting for her. Waiting for her to come closer. "Are you okay?" Emily asked, her voice softer this time. She wasn't sure if he could hear her or if he even cared to. But something about him, something in the way he stood, made her feel that they were connected, that they were both survivors of something neither of them fully understood. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. There was something in his gaze, something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't relief either. It was a mixture of confusion and wariness, as if he had been expecting her, or maybe just anyone at all. "I'm not sure," he said quietly, his voice low and rough, as though he hadn't spoken in a long time. I woke up like this. Alone. I thought I was dreaming. Emily stood still, taking in his words. He wasn't the only one. They were both alone in a city that was now empty. The realization hit her harder than anything else. This wasn't a dream. It was real. And they were the only ones left. My name's Emily, she said, her voice breaking the silence. She didn't know what else to say. There was no script for this moment. No explanation for what had happened to the world, to the city. But this man, this stranger, was the only person she had seen. He was the only connection to the outside world, the only other soul who had survived. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing her words, but still didn't speak. I don't know what happened, Emily continued, her voice trembling. But I can't be the only one. There has to be more people. The man's eyes darkened slightly as he shook his head. No. I've been looking too. I've seen no one else. They stood there in the street, two strangers, facing each other in the midst of a city that had been swallowed by silence. The world, once filled with the noise of life, had turned into an empty shell. Emily's mind raced as she tried to piece together what had happened. Was there anyone else? Was there a reason she and this man were the only ones left? And then it hit her, they could see each other. That was something she couldn't ignore. In this empty world, they were not alone. But why? The silence was overwhelming, but Emily's senses were heightened by it. Every step she took felt like an echo, as though the whole world was holding its breath. She didn't know how long she had been walking, or how far she had ventured, but something about the strange figure standing in the middle of the street, just a few yards away from her, made her heart race. She couldn't look away. The man was there, standing still, his back slightly turned, but his posture alert. His face was hidden under a dark hood, and the jacket he wore looked worn and weathered, too old for someone in a city that had been bustling with life just days ago. She took a step toward him. Slowly, cautiously, as if approaching an unknown force. He's real. He must be. But the closer she got, the more the question lingered. Why was he the only person she had seen in this desolate city? Where were the others? What had happened to everyone? Hello? Emily called out, her voice trembling more than she'd expected. She cleared her throat and tried again, this time more firmly. Can you hear me? The man didn't turn to face her immediately. For a long moment, he simply remained motionless, his back to her. She could see the way the wind lifted the hood of his jacket, revealing a hint of messy, dark hair beneath. Then finally he turned slowly. His face was lined with exhaustion, with days, maybe weeks, of solitude. His eyes were deep and weary, as if he had seen things that no one should have to witness. Yet there was something in his gaze, something both sorrowful and surprisingly hopeful. Yes, he said, his voice hoarse, almost as if he hadn't spoken in days. I can hear you. Emily felt a surge of emotion at his words. The weight of her loneliness, the isolation she had been feeling since waking up in this empty world, seemed to lift just a little. There was someone else. He's real. She wasn't imagining him. But why had he been here, in the middle of this ghost town, alone? What's going on? She asked, her voice quieter now, more tentative. Where is everyone? Why is the city empty? He looked around, his eyes scanning the barren streets before meeting hers again. I don't know, he said, shaking his head. I woke up, like you I suppose. Alone. His voice cracked slightly, as though he too had been searching for answers for a long time. Emily felt the strange weight of those words, like you. There was something in his tone, in the way he said it, that made her wonder how much he knew. How long had he been searching, wandering this city just like she had? What had he seen? So you're the only other person? She asked, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over her, though the fear was still there. The emptiness of the city still gnawed at her insides. You didn't see anyone else? No one, he said, his voice growing softer. I've been walking for days. Searching. Trying to find someone, anyone. But there's no one. Emily felt a chill run through her. She glanced around again, half expecting to see someone, anyone, emerge from the shadows. But the streets remained empty. She noticed the same eerie silence hanging over everything, even more pronounced now. There was no sound at all. No birds, no animals. Just stillness. Do you know what happened? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted to the buildings around them, his face darkening as though the memories of the empty city were too much to bear. He looked down, the weight of her question pressing heavily between them. "No," he said at last. "I've been trying to figure that out for myself." He rubbed his eyes, exhausted. "I don't know how this happened. I don't know where everyone went. But I've been here long enough to know that whatever happened, it wasn't just an accident." Emily felt a tightness in her chest. She had suspected something similar, but hearing him say it out loud made her stomach churn. It wasn't an accident. Something else was at play. But what? "Why are we here?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Why are we the ones left? What's so special about us?" The man's gaze hardened. He looked at her for a long moment, studying her face, as if trying to gauge whether she was just as lost as he was. Then he spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "I don't know. But I think we're meant to find out." Emily felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity stir inside her. They were meant to find out what had happened, to unravel the mystery of the world that had suddenly turned silent. And maybe, just maybe, they were meant to find a way to survive it together. "We're not alone," she said, her voice firm now. "Not anymore. I've been looking for someone too. And now I've found you. We can figure this out together." The man, who had been so guarded before, seemed to soften. A faint, almost imperceptible smile flickered on his lips as he looked at her. "You're right," he said quietly. "Together. But there's still a lot we don't know." He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing right in front of her. The distance between them felt like a chasm, so much had happened, and they had no answers, but Emily felt something else too. A small, flickering sense of hope. For the first time since she had woken up in this empty world, she didn't feel entirely alone. "We'll figure this out," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Together." The man nodded. "Together." They stood there for a moment, looking out over the empty streets. The wind picked up, rustling the fallen leaves and carrying with it the scent of the unknown. The city was silent, but they were no longer truly alone. The mystery of the world was only just beginning to unfold, and Emily knew that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it by herself. The days that followed were a strange, unsettling blur. Emily and Jack spent much of their time wandering the empty streets, exploring the vast city they both called home, now abandoned by everyone but the two of them. The silence was oppressive, but there was something in the way they moved together, quietly, yet with a sense of purpose, that made Emily feel as though maybe there was hope after all. Jack had become her anchor, the only real connection she had left in this vast, desolate world. They didn't need words to understand each other. There was a kind of telepathic understanding between them, a bond forged not by history, but by necessity. They both knew that the only way they would survive this emptiness was by staying together. Each day, they ventured out into the city, searching for food, water, and any answers they could find. The place was a ghost town, and every corner they turned revealed the quiet aftermath of whatever had happened. Abandoned cars sat idly at traffic lights, rusting in the open air. Storefronts stood untouched, with dusty windows that seemed to be holding onto the ghosts of their past customers. Every building was a silent reminder of a world that no longer existed. At first, the silence was deafening. Emily would have given anything to hear the hum of a conversation, the sound of a door opening, the shuffle of feet in the distance. But it was just them. And the city. And the stillness that hung in the air like a thick fog. But as the days passed, something began to change. The overwhelming sense of loneliness started to fade, replaced by a quiet comfort whenever she was near Jack. There was something about the way he was always there, without question, that made Emily feel like she wasn't truly alone. She started to look forward to their walks, their shared moments of silent understanding. One afternoon, as they walked through the park, one of the few places where trees still swayed in the wind, their leaves bright with life, Emily stopped, looking at Jack. He was standing by a broken fountain, staring down at the cracked stone, lost in thought. "You know," she said softly, "I never thought I'd be here, doing this." Jack turned to her, his brow furrowed in curiosity. "What do you mean?" I always thought that when something like this happened, if something like this ever happened, I would be scared. I thought I'd be so overwhelmed by the emptiness, by the silence, that I'd just break. I didn't think I'd be able to handle it." Jack nodded slowly, his eyes studying her. And yet, here we are. Together. Emily's heart fluttered at the simple words. There was no denying the truth in them. Here they were, surviving together in this empty world. And as strange as it felt, the bond between them was undeniable. In the silence, in the absence of everyone else, they had found something in each other. I don't know how we got here, she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. But I'm glad you're here. I'm glad I'm not alone. Jack's gaze softened, and for the first time, Emily saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, something deeper, something warmer. I'm glad too. I think I needed you as much as you needed me. The words hung between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them was still, but within that stillness, there was an unspoken connection growing, a connection that neither of them could ignore. For the first time since Emily had woken up alone in this empty city, she didn't feel as if she were drifting aimlessly. With Jack by her side, she felt like there was something worth fighting for, something worth holding on to. The next few days were spent in a strange new rhythm. They continued to search for food and supplies, but their routines were changing. Instead of the overwhelming anxiety that had gripped Emily in the first days of their isolation, there was now a sense of calm that she couldn't quite explain. Jack had a way of grounding her. He never rushed, never panicked, even when they didn't know where their next meal would come from. They began to make their temporary home in an old library, a quiet place, filled with dusty shelves and forgotten knowledge. The building felt safe, sheltered from the outside world. Here they could sit together, read, and share thoughts without the pressure of constant searching. One evening, as Emily sat by the window, watching the last rays of sunlight flicker across the empty streets, she felt Jack's presence beside her. She had become accustomed to his silent company, but tonight, there was something different in the air. The quiet was heavier, almost like it was waiting for something to happen. You ever wonder if there's more of us? Emily asked, breaking the silence. Jack looked at her, his expression thoughtful. Every day. I think about it all the time. I keep looking for someone else, but I haven't found anyone. Emily nodded, but she wasn't so sure anymore. She didn't know if there would ever be more survivors, but there was something about Jack's presence that felt like a sign. Maybe, just maybe, they were meant to find each other. In a world that had been reduced to nothing, their bond was becoming something extraordinary. She turned to him, her gaze meeting his. There was no need for words now. They both understood. In this vast emptiness, they had found each other, and that was all that mattered. Over the next few days, Emily began to notice subtle changes in her feelings toward Jack. What had begun as companionship had grown into something more, a connection that was deepening with every passing moment. She found herself seeking him out, sharing more with him, laughing at the odd moments they shared together. The world outside was still desolate, but here in their little corner of it, there was something more than just survival. There was life. And perhaps that was the key. Maybe, in a world that had stripped away everything else, it was love that remained. The bond they had forged was fragile but strong, like the foundation of something new. Something that could rebuild what had been lost. They were no longer just two strangers, lost in a sea of silence. They were partners. Survivors. And in each other's presence, they found something worth holding on to, something worth building. The days were starting to blend into one another, each one marked by their routines of searching for food, finding water, and scavenging for supplies. But the longer Emily spent with Jack, the more she noticed how time seemed to stretch, and the silence of the world grew heavier. Their quiet moments together had become a comforting rhythm, but there was always an undercurrent of unease, a feeling that something was missing, that there was more to their situation than met the eye. It was a morning, just as the sun began to creep over the skyline, that Emily found herself drawn to an old building they had never entered before, the city library. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the accident, and Emily had made it her goal to explore every corner of the city in search of answers. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many things she didn't understand. She could feel herself starting to crack under the weight of the unknown, the need to find something, anything, that could explain the vast emptiness around her. Jack had stayed behind that morning, looking over some of the food they had scavenged. He had been quieter recently, his thoughts seemingly distant. Emily knew he was struggling too, but there was something else in the air, an invisible wall between them that hadn't been there before. Perhaps it was the uncertainty of their circumstances, Or maybe it was the creeping suspicion that they were just the last survivors in a world that had been obliterated by forces they couldn't comprehend. The library had always been a symbol of knowledge, and Emily felt drawn to it now, as though it held the key to understanding what had happened to the world. Inside, it was a relic of a life long gone, books piled up on every shelf, thick dust coating everything, and a quiet, oppressive atmosphere that made her skin crawl. But it was also the only place left that seemed to hold a trace of what had once been, a place of learning, of civilization. She wandered through the aisles, her fingers brushing against the spines of books, many of which were too old to even be readable. But as she moved deeper into the heart of the building, she stumbled upon something that caught her attention, a small, hidden door tucked in the back corner of the library. The door was partially open, as though it had been waiting for her to find it. Her breath caught in her chest as she walked toward it. Her instinct told her to open it, to see what lay behind. The air felt charged with something she couldn't explain, a pull, a sense of fate. She pushed the door open cautiously, her heart racing with anticipation. Inside was a small room, far different from the rest of the library. It was filled with rows of old file cabinets, each one filled with papers, photographs, and documents. But these weren't just any papers, these were reports, scientific journals, and research notes. They were neatly organized, and the first thing Emily noticed was the title on the top of the first folder she opened, Project Regenesis, the experiment on human isolation. Her mind raced as she flipped through the documents, each one revealing more shocking information than the last. It all started to fall into place, the city, the silence, the emptiness. Emily's hands shook as she sifted through the papers. The experiment had been designed to isolate a group of people in order to study the psychological and physiological effects of complete isolation. The city had been a test site, a controlled environment where the inhabitants were unknowingly placed under surveillance. The goal had been to observe their reactions, their ability to survive, and how they would behave without the influence of the outside world. But the experiment had gone wrong. As she dug deeper, Emily found the names of those involved in the project, including several researchers who had been overseeing the isolation. The experiment, however, had faced several unforeseen consequences. A catastrophic failure had led to the abrupt termination of the project, and all of the people in the city had been wiped out, except for her, and it seemed, Jack. The documents suggested that Emily and Jack were intended survivors, part of a final phase of the experiment. They had been selected to remain in the empty city, the last living participants, while the rest of the population had been deliberately exposed to a virus designed to test their immune responses. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in a way that made Emily's stomach churn. She wasn't here by accident. She was part of the experiment. She was one of the chosen few to survive, but for what purpose? But the documents revealed something else, something even more chilling. It wasn't just a matter of survival. They were being watched. There were still researchers monitoring the experiment remotely. The reason Emily and Jack had been left alive wasn't just to see how they would cope with isolation, but because they were part of an ongoing study. The researchers had been observing them from the shadows, analyzing their every move, every emotion, every conversation. Emily slammed the folder shut, her mind racing. She felt betrayed, manipulated. Everything, the silence, the emptiness, had been part of a larger controlled experiment, one that had played with their lives. The world she had known was nothing more than a grand experiment, and the people who had once lived in it were mere subjects. The thought was too much to bear. Emily sat down on the floor of the small room, overwhelmed by the enormity of the discovery. She had come into the library seeking answers, but what she had found only raised more questions. Why had they been chosen? What was the ultimate goal of this experiment? And how long had the researchers been watching them, waiting for their reactions? She felt the weight of the truth pressing on her chest, suffocating her. The city wasn't just empty, it was empty for a reason. And she, along with Jack, was caught in the middle of it all. When she returned to the apartment where Jack had been waiting, her mind was a whirlwind. She didn't know how to tell him the truth. How could she? How could she explain that their lives, their every move, had been a part of someone's cruel experiment? And what did that mean for them now? As she walked in, Jack looked up at her from the corner of the room, his eyes tired but filled with an unspoken question. Emily stood in the doorway, her gaze distant, her thoughts still caught in the flood of revelations she had just uncovered. "We need to talk," she said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. The truth was out. But what would they do with it? The silence of the empty city felt heavier now that Emily knew the truth. The streets, once quiet with only the echoes of her footsteps, now felt like an oppressive reminder of the experiment that had shaped her life and the lives of everyone around her. She had always known that something was off, but now, the weight of reality pressed down on her chest. They were nothing more than pawns in someone's twisted game. The knowledge that she and Jack were part of a grand experiment, that their survival wasn't random, shook her to her core. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, though that stung deeply. It was the fact that the world she had once known was a lie. The city, her life, everything she had taken for granted had been engineered, designed, and controlled. And now, with the knowledge of this truth, she was left with a gnawing question: what do we do now? She walked back to their makeshift home in the library, her footsteps slow, her heart heavy. Jack would want to know what she had found. The library was where they had taken shelter, a quiet, safe space amid the chaos of the empty world. But now it felt like a prison, a reminder of the control that had been forced upon them. The thought of returning to the room where they had shared laughter, silence, and everything in between made her stomach twist with a mix of dread and uncertainty. When she stepped inside, Jack was sitting near the window, his back to her, looking out over the empty city. The fading sunlight caught the edges of his silhouette, making him seem almost ethereal, like a ghost in the midst of a forgotten world. He turned to face her as she entered, his eyes filled with the same quiet understanding they always shared. "You found something, didn't you?" Jack's voice was steady, but there was a note of concern in his tone. He knew she had been looking for answers. She had spent the last few days combing through the city, trying to find some clue about what had happened, some piece of the puzzle that would make sense of their terrifying new reality. Emily didn't say anything at first. She simply sat down beside him, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the weight of the truth hung between them, a heavy presence neither of them knew how to address. When Emily finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost as if she feared the words themselves might be too much to bear. "They did this to us," she said, her voice breaking. "The city, everything, it was all part of an experiment. They chose us to survive. The others were wiped out. And we were left to see how we would react, how we would cope." Jack's expression didn't change. He sat quietly for a moment, processing her words. The silence stretched between them, both of them grappling with the same truth, yet each of them experiencing it in their own way. "I knew something was off," Jack said, his voice low. "I felt it. But hearing it out loud, it doesn't make it easier, does it?" Emily shook her head. "No, it doesn't." For a long time, they sat in silence, the weight of the world pressing down on them both. And yet, despite the fear and the uncertainty, there was still a thread of something else, a quiet, growing bond between them that hadn't been there before. "I don't want to be part of their game anymore," Emily whispered, her eyes meeting Jack's. "I want to live, Jack. I want to make something of this, even if we're the only ones left." Jack looked at her, his gaze soft but unwavering. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. In that moment, something shifted. There was no more fear, no more isolation. Just the quiet understanding that they were in this together. "I'm with you," he said, his voice steady and sure. "We'll figure this out. Together." In the weeks that followed, Emily and Jack began to rebuild. At first, it was simple survival. They scavenged for food, found fresh water, and made a home in the library. But as time passed, something began to change. Their bond, forged in the emptiness of the city, began to evolve into something more than just companionship. It was love. Quiet, simple, but strong enough to fill the void left by everything they had lost. They had no one else. No one but each other. And in that isolation, in that fear of what had happened and what might happen next, they found solace in each other's presence. Their love wasn't born from the normal, bustling world they had once known. It was born from the emptiness, from the need to survive, to feel something, anything, in the face of so much loss. Every day they spent together, every moment of silence, every quiet conversation, their connection grew stronger. They began to rely on each other, not just for survival, but for comfort. There was something deeply intimate about their relationship. They didn't need words anymore to communicate. A glance, a touch, was enough. They understood each other in a way no one else could. One night, as they sat together in the library, Emily leaned her head on Jack's shoulder. The quiet of the world outside seemed to soften in that moment. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace. I never thought I could feel this way again, she murmured, her voice filled with quiet wonder. Jack kissed the top of her head. Neither did I. They didn't need to say anything more. They both understood that, despite everything they had been through, despite the devastation of the world around them, they had found something real. Something worth fighting for. And as the days passed, their love became their strength. It was the thing that kept them going, the thing that gave them hope in a world that had none left. Emily and Jack's relationship had grown deeper with each passing day. In the midst of their new, isolated life, they had found something rare, a bond that was unspoken yet undeniable, forged in the silence of the world they now inhabited. Every morning, they woke up to the stillness, but the quiet no longer suffocated them. It was their shared silence, their shared understanding, that brought comfort. But now, as the days turned into weeks, the weight of the unknown pressed more heavily on them. They had built a small makeshift life in the library, scavenging food, filtering water, and fortifying their sanctuary against the world outside. But the question that lingered in Emily's mind, what now, was never far away. They had no answers. They had no idea why they were left behind, why they were the last survivors of a city that had once thrived. And despite their growing love for each other, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The truth was that they had been abandoned. The experiment had ended, and they had been left to live out the rest of their days in isolation. But what was the point? The researchers were long gone, or so it seemed, leaving Emily and Jack to fend for themselves. Yet, as time passed, Emily began to feel a deep, unsettling presence. Something wasn't right. One night, as they sat in the library, looking through the remnants of old documents and photos, Emily's mind raced. She had grown increasingly restless, not just with the silence, but with the lack of answers. She needed to know what had happened. They both did. She couldn't bear the thought that they were just left here, abandoned like relics of some forgotten test. We need to know the truth, she said suddenly, her voice urgent. Jack, who had been quietly flipping through a weathered book, glanced up at her. What do you mean? The city, the experiment, Emily continued. We can't just live here forever, Jack. We need to know why we're the only ones left. We need to understand what happened. Jack stood up slowly, his face darkening as he walked toward the window, looking out at the city. His shoulders were tense, his brow furrowed. And what if we don't like the answer? He asked quietly. What if the truth is worse than we imagine? Emily's heart clenched at the thought, but she knew she couldn't live in this limbo forever. I don't care. I need to know. We need to know what happened to the world we knew. For the first time, Jack didn't argue. Instead he nodded, his eyes meeting hers. He too felt it, the gnawing need to understand, to confront whatever had caused their isolation. He could no longer hide from the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. That night, they decided to go back to the government facility they had stumbled upon weeks earlier, the one where Emily had discovered the initial documents about the experiment. It was a building they had avoided, unsure of what secrets it might hold. But now, Emily felt that they had no choice but to face whatever awaited them inside. The journey there was silent, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The streets they walked were eerily quiet, as they had been since the accident. The buildings around them were skeletal, their once grand facades now crumbling. It was as though the world had stopped, leaving only the memories of what had been. When they arrived at the facility, Emily's heart raced in anticipation, but Jack hesitated. He placed a hand on her shoulder, stopping her. Are you sure you want to do this? He asked, his voice tight. We don't know what we'll find in there. What if it changes everything? Emily met his gaze, feeling a surge of determination. I'm already changed, Jack. I need to know the truth. We both do. He sighed, nodding reluctantly. Then we do this together. The heavy metal door creaked open as they entered the facility, the air stale and cold. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered above them, casting long shadows across the hall. The place was a graveyard of forgotten experiments, files scattered across desks, old computers that had long since stopped working, and machines that had no use anymore. They moved through the building cautiously, each step echoing in the empty space. Eventually, they came to a small office at the end of the hallway. The door was ajar, and as they pushed it open, the smell of dust and decay hit them. At the desk sat a man who was not Jack, but someone entirely different. He was old, his hair gray, his face gaunt. He didn't seem startled to see them, as if he had been waiting for them. His eyes were hollow, distant, as if he had been trapped in this place for far too long. Emily froze. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. The man looked up at them, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I knew you'd come eventually," he said in a voice that sounded almost too calm. "I've been waiting for you." Jack stepped forward, his fists clenched. "What is this place? What happened to the city?" The man's smile faded as he leaned back in his chair. "The experiment," he said, "was never about isolation. It was about control. We wanted to see how you would respond to being isolated, cut off from the world. We wanted to see if you could survive on your own. But we never anticipated that you two would be the ones left behind." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the man spoke. "Left behind," she repeated. "You mean, you didn't want us to survive?" The man's eyes darkened. "No. We didn't expect it. You weren't meant to be the survivors. The others were expendable." Jack stepped forward, his voice rising with anger. "And you've been watching us this whole time, haven't you? What is it you want from us?" The man's eyes flickered with something, guilt perhaps. "I wanted to stop it," he said quietly. "I wanted to end the experiment. But it's too late. You're already part of it. There's no going back." Emily's mind reeled as she processed his words. The reality of their situation was worse than she could have imagined. The city had never been real to begin with. It had been nothing more than a controlled experiment, and she and Jack were the last remaining pieces of the puzzle. They were trapped in a world that was never meant to be their own. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of the truth pressed down on them all. Finally, Emily turned to Jack, her heart heavy with the enormity of it all. "Then what do we do now?" she whispered. Jack looked at her, his eyes full of the same uncertainty that filled her own. But in that moment, he knew the answer. "We survive," he said simply. "We survive, and we live. Together." The revelation that Emily and Jack had been part of a grand, twisted experiment hung heavily between them. The walls of the abandoned facility, once a place of scientific curiosity, now felt like a tomb, empty, devoid of life, and haunted by the ghosts of those who had created it. The man in the office, the last reminder of the experiment's architects, had offered no comfort, only cold, unsettling truths. But despite the horrors of their situation, something shifted in Emily's heart as Jack's words echoed in her mind. "We survive. We live. Together." The truth had shattered everything they thought they knew about their world, but it had also given them clarity. They were survivors, yes, but they were also more than that. They were free, in a way that no one else had been for so long. The world outside was desolate, but it was theirs to explore, rebuild, and most importantly shape. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing: they would face it together. The following days were filled with a strange sense of urgency mixed with an unfamiliar sense of hope. They left the government facility behind, the weight of the man's cryptic words still hanging over them, but instead of feeling crushed by it, they were energized. For the first time since waking up in the empty city, Emily could sense the possibility of something new. The library, which had been their sanctuary, became the place where they began to plan their next steps. They scoured the old bookshelves for anything useful: survival guides, maps, historical texts, anything that could offer a clue about how to start over in a world that had turned its back on them. They were alone, but they were not powerless. Jack had always been resourceful, and Emily had a sharp mind for problem-solving. Together they started to make a list of supplies they needed: food, tools, more water, and most importantly, seeds to begin planting. The empty city had once been a place of concrete and steel, but it could become a place of life again if they worked together. They dreamed of a garden, a small patch of green in the middle of the desolation. As the days turned to weeks, they began to leave the library more often. The city was still empty, and the silence remained, but it didn't feel like the finality it once had. Every morning, they walked the streets together, collecting what they could find, working side by side. They found a greenhouse just a few blocks away, its glass cracked and dirted but still functional. There, they began their first small garden, sowing seeds into the cracked earth. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One evening, as they sat on the steps of the library, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emily turned to Jack. There was something different in the air, something more tangible than the silence of the world. It was as if the very act of creating something, of building a future, had brought a kind of life back to their hearts. "Do you think we can really do this?" Emily asked, her voice soft but filled with a quiet conviction. Jack glanced at her, his eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "We have no choice," he said with a small smile. "This is our world now. And I don't know about you, but I'm not just going to survive, I'm going to live." His words echoed in Emily's mind, reminding her that the will to live was more than just an instinct. It was a choice, something they both had to fight for day after day. The emptiness around them would never be easy to ignore, but together, they had something worth fighting for. They had each other, and they had a future to create. As the weeks passed, Emily and Jack's bond grew even stronger. They shared everything: ideas, fears, hopes, and dreams. Their quiet companionship had blossomed into a deep, unshakable love. And as they worked together to bring life back into the city, they also found themselves learning more about one another. They began to share memories of their past lives, their families, their childhoods, their long-lost loves. Emily told Jack about her mother, her estranged relationship with her father, and how she had always felt like something was missing. Jack shared his story too, how he had grown up in a small town, lost both of his parents at a young age, and had spent much of his adult life feeling disconnected, adrift in the busy, crowded world. Now they had each other. And though they were the last two people on Earth, Emily had never felt so alive. They were not just surviving anymore. They were building. One afternoon, while they were working in their garden, Emily paused and looked at Jack. He was kneeling by the soil, his hands covered in dirt, a look of focus on his face. She smiled, watching him. It was strange to think about how far they had come in such a short time. Just a few weeks ago, they had been strangers, lost in a city full of silence. Now they were partners, facing this strange, new world together. "Do you ever wonder if we're the only ones left?" Emily asked, her voice quiet as she approached him. Jack looked up, his eyes thoughtful. "Every day," he said. "But I don't think it matters. We're here. And we have a chance to make something of this." For a moment, Emily just looked at him, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She didn't know what the future held, or if they were the only survivors, or if there would ever be others to join them. But she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't alone anymore. And with Jack by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. As they sat together, watching the sun sink below the horizon, Emily realized that the emptiness no longer felt like a curse. It had become a blank canvas, a place where they could create their own future. They had the power to rebuild, to create something new from the ashes of the old world. And they would do it together. The sun had long since set, casting the city in a soft, muted twilight. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of movement from Emily and Jack as they continued their daily routine of scavenging, planting, and building. Every day was a new challenge, but it was one they faced together. With each passing day, the city, once abandoned and forgotten, felt just a little more alive. The garden they had started was thriving. What had once been a small patch of dirt, neglected and cracked, was now filled with rows of vegetables and herbs. The once barren concrete jungle now had tiny pockets of green peeking through the cracks, symbolizing their resilience. They had started small: tomatoes, cucumbers, and lettuce, but each harvest brought them closer to the dream of rebuilding a self-sustaining life. The joy of seeing the fruits of their labor grow had become their new hope. But there was more to rebuild than just the land. They had to rebuild themselves, too. Emily had been reflecting on their progress one evening, her hands on her hips as she looked over the garden. Jack, his shirt soaked in sweat, was pulling weeds from between the rows of plants. It was moments like this, when she saw the quiet dedication in his actions, that she realized how far they had come. In the beginning, everything had felt like a survival instinct: find food, find water, find shelter. It had been about basic survival. But now, there was something different in the air. Something that wasn't just about getting by, but about living. They had created something. And that something was worth protecting. The next morning, Emily and Jack woke up early. The light filtering through the library's dusty windows warmed the air, and there was a sense of purpose between them. Today, they had planned to expand their garden and begin collecting supplies for something bigger, something more permanent. Emily had found an old blueprint for a greenhouse in one of the books she had scavenged, and together, they began discussing the possibility of building it. "It's time," Emily said, her voice steady, a sense of resolve in her tone. "We've been working with what we have, but we need more. If we're going to make this work long-term, We need to build something that can last. A greenhouse would be a good start. Jack, wiping the sweat from his brow, looked at her with a spark of excitement in his eyes. You think we can actually build it? Why not? Emily smiled. We've already done the hardest part. Now we just need to keep building, one step at a time. They spent the next few days gathering materials, old wood from a dilapidated warehouse, nails and screws from abandoned stores, and plastic sheeting they found in a nearby construction site. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of it all felt like too much to bear. They were doing the work of a whole community, just the two of them. But every time Emily looked at Jack, every time she saw him bending over to hammer nails into place or pulling more materials from a heap they had gathered, she knew they were doing the right thing. And every evening, as the sky grew dark and the stars lit up above them, they would sit together outside, in the small clearing they had made, and simply watch the progress. There was something peaceful in those moments, something that reminded Emily that even in the most broken world, there was still room for beauty. It wasn't just the greenhouse they were building, it was a future. And in that future, they saw a new kind of community. Emily's thoughts often wandered to what lay ahead. The city might be empty now, but they weren't the only survivors. There had to be more. And maybe, just maybe, they could start to rebuild something greater than just themselves. She imagined others, perhaps lost and wandering, waiting to find someone like them. Perhaps one day their little corner of the world could grow into something bigger, a sanctuary where others could come, a place of hope where life could begin again. But as the days turned into weeks, and the work on the greenhouse progressed, Emily's hope began to grow. They had created something tangible, something that could help them survive. And more than that, it had given them a reason to look beyond the present, beyond the isolation, and see a future. A future filled with possibility. One afternoon, as they worked on the greenhouse, Jack stopped suddenly, wiping his hands on his pants. I've been thinking, he said, his voice hesitant. Emily looked up from where she was arranging the beams, sensing that something was on his mind. What about? She asked, setting down her tools. About us, Jack began, his eyes locking with hers. About what comes next. What if we're not the only ones? What if there are others out there, like us? Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had thought about that, of course, had wondered if there were other survivors hidden in some corner of the world, waiting for the right moment to emerge. But to hear Jack say it, to acknowledge the possibility, made the idea feel more real. There have to be, Emily said softly. There's no way we're the only ones. It doesn't make sense. Jack nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. Then we need to be ready. We need to build something for them. Something that can grow. Emily smiled, her heart swelling with pride. That's exactly what I've been thinking. We're not just building for ourselves. We're building for everyone who will come. The idea of a new community, a place where survivors could find safety, where they could rebuild, resonated deeply with both of them. They had no idea if others were out there, but they knew that they couldn't wait forever. They needed to prepare for the future, for a future that was theirs to shape. As the greenhouse neared completion, Emily and Jack worked tirelessly, using every bit of their ingenuity and resourcefulness. They planted more crops, filled the small makeshift garden with herbs and vegetables, and made plans to continue expanding their food supply. With each new day, they felt a sense of accomplishment, but more than that, they felt a sense of belonging to this place they were creating together. It wasn't the city they had once known. It wasn't the world they had lost. But it was something new. Something hopeful. The world outside was still empty, but inside their little corner of it, Emily and Jack were building a new life. A life built on love, hard work, and the belief that together, they could create something beautiful from the ashes of the old world. They didn't know what the future would hold, or what the rest of the world would look like when it was finally ready to rebuild. But they knew one thing for sure, they were no longer just surviving. They were living. And they were building something that could last, a future full of possibility. Emily sat on the edge of the makeshift porch they had built on the edge of their garden, staring out at the city. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the abandoned streets. The air was cool, but there was a sense of warmth where she sat, nestled in the corner of their sanctuary. Jack sat beside her, silently watching the same scene. In the stillness of the world, their silence spoke louder than any words ever could. It had been months since they had first come together, two strangers wandering through a desolate city. Now they had built something, together. The greenhouse stood tall beside their garden, its clear panels reflecting the dying light of the day. Their small space had transformed into a refuge, not just for survival, but for hope. Hope for the future. Still, Emily couldn't ignore the quiet fear that lingered at the edges of her mind. Was it enough? Was it enough to simply build a life for themselves in this vast, empty world? She often wondered if there was more to their existence than just survival. Could they ever really build a future in a city that had once been full of life? Jack seemed to sense her thoughts without her having to voice them. His hand gently found hers, offering the same silent support he had for months now. Together, they had learned to find peace in each other. But she couldn't help but feel the heavy weight of the unknown. "Do you ever wonder if there are more of us out there?" Emily asked, her voice soft, almost uncertain. Jack turned to her, his gaze steady. "I think about it all the time. We can't be the only ones. We might be the only ones in this city, but the world is vast. There must be others." His voice was full of conviction, yet there was an underlying sadness, a recognition that the world they knew was lost, and the new world they would build would be vastly different. The thought of others, of perhaps finding another group of survivors, had crossed Emily's mind many times. She had tried to push it away, focusing instead on their daily work and the small victories they had accomplished. Yet, as Jack's words hung in the air, she realized just how deeply the hope for connection ran within her. "I've been thinking," Emily hesitated, her fingers brushing against Jack's. "What if there's a way we can reach out? What if we can find them, wherever they are? What if we're not meant to be alone?" Jack gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "We've already started building something, Em. And maybe that's the first step. Maybe we're supposed to build, not just for us, but for others. A place where people can come, where they can find safety and start over. A community." The words echoed between them. A community. It was a thought that had lingered in the back of Emily's mind but had never fully taken shape until now. They had built a life for themselves from the ground up, starting with a garden, then the greenhouse, and now, the beginnings of something greater. They had created a space where survival was possible, but could they extend that to others? As the days passed, Emily and Jack discussed their ideas. They began to plan. Not just for their future, but for anyone who might come across their small sanctuary. They started clearing more land around their garden, preparing areas for new homes, even gathering the necessary tools and resources to begin building more sustainable shelters. They dreamed of a community where people could find peace and safety, a place where they could rebuild society, even if only on a small scale. They found more supplies, furniture, tools, and items left behind by others who, like them, had disappeared. Emily collected books, trying to create some kind of education space, something to pass on the knowledge they had. Jack worked tirelessly to secure more food sources, building new storage spaces and digging deeper wells for water. Each new day brought them closer to the dream they had started to form, a rebirth of hope. It wasn't just the practical things that changed. There was a new energy between them. They no longer moved through their days in the silence of survival. The bond between Emily and Jack had grown, expanding beyond the quiet companionship of two isolated people. They found joy in the little things, the way the sun felt on their skin, the laughter that seemed to come more easily now, the peace of knowing that they had found each other in this world. One morning, Emily woke early, as she had done many times before. The sun was barely up, casting a faint pink light over the world. She sat on the porch alone for a while, letting the morning air fill her lungs. She looked over at Jack, who was still sleeping soundly inside. The quiet peace between them was something she had never imagined possible. As the day began to stir, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. This was their purpose. They were not meant to be alone forever. They were meant to build something. Something bigger than just survival. Something for the future. She turned toward the horizon, feeling for the first time that the empty city, once a symbol of everything lost, could now become a symbol of hope. It was time. Time to make a real difference. Time to reach out. The next few weeks were spent in a flurry of preparation. Emily and Jack worked together to create a plan for expanding their little sanctuary. They marked out areas for new buildings, started gathering any tools and materials they could find, and even began drafting a blueprint for a community center where they could meet with other survivors, if they came. They knew that this was a long shot. There were no guarantees. But the effort itself gave them both something to hold on to, something to fight for. And slowly, a community began to form, not of people, but of ideas. Ideas for how to rebuild what was lost, how to create a new society from the ground up. Emily spent long hours thinking about the people they might meet. Who would they be? What kind of lives had they led before? What did they need? What could they offer? She and Jack had so little, but they had each other, and that was a start. It was a foundation for something greater. It was a rebirth. One evening, after a long day of work, Emily stood on the porch, looking out over the makeshift village they had started. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Jack came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She leaned back into him, feeling the warmth of his body against hers. "We've done good," Jack murmured into her hair. Emily smiled softly. "We've just begun." They stood there for a long moment, watching the city they had inherited transform before their eyes. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close. But it was the beginning of something new. Together, they had created something worth building on, a place for people to come together, to heal, and to live again. As Emily looked up at Jack, she knew that they had already begun the most important journey of all. Not just the journey of survival, but the journey of hope. The world outside was still broken, but within the walls they had created, they had found the strength to build something beautiful, something enduring. They had found the courage to live. And for the first time since the world had changed, Emily finally allowed herself to believe in the future again. The days had turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Emily and Jack's small sanctuary had grown into something far greater than they had imagined. The foundation of their community was solidifying, with each day bringing more hope, more purpose. What had started with just two people, isolated in a silent world, had become a symbol of resilience, a place where new life was being cultivated, both in the soil and in their hearts. They had planted seeds, not only in the ground but in their future. The garden that once began as a simple survival measure was now lush, abundant, and full of life. The greenhouse they had built was thriving with fresh vegetables, and their once small dream of self-sufficiency had blossomed into a community garden that stretched beyond their immediate needs. Emily and Jack had created more than a life for themselves, they had created a refuge. As the community began to take shape, they attracted others, survivors who had heard the whispers of their little haven, those who had wandered the empty streets like Emily and Jack had, only to find solace in a place that promised a new beginning. The quiet, deserted city had slowly transformed into something alive again. But there was still so much to do. Emily spent her mornings helping newcomers, teaching them how to plant, how to grow, how to adapt to this new world. Jack worked with the others to build shelters, ensuring that every new arrival had a place to stay, a sense of belonging. The work was hard, but it was meaningful. It felt like they were building a new world, brick by brick, seed by seed, day by day. Despite the progress, Emily still found herself lying awake at night, her mind racing. It was hard not to question the future. There was no guarantee that the world would stay the same, that more people wouldn't come, that they wouldn't face challenges they couldn't overcome. But every time her mind veered into the unknown, she would look over at Jack. He was there. He was always there. Jack had become her constant, the thing that kept her grounded when everything else seemed uncertain. But it wasn't just survival that kept them together, it was love. Their love had been tested, shaped by the hardship they had endured, the loneliness, the fear. But it had only grown stronger with time, rooted in the belief that together, they could face anything. One evening, as they sat on the porch together, watching the last rays of the sun fade into the horizon, Emily felt a surge of gratitude for Jack. He was the one who had stayed with her, who had believed in their future when she had doubts. He was the reason she had learned to hope again. "I think we're doing something incredible here," she said quietly, breaking the silence between them. Jack turned to her, a soft smile playing on his lips. "We're doing it together," he said. "And that makes all the difference." Emily's heart swelled at his words. It wasn't just the work they had done, the people they had helped, the life they had built, it was the love they had found in each other. Their journey, once filled with uncertainty and fear, had become something extraordinary. It had become a life, their life, a life they were building not just for survival, but for the future. The future. It was something Emily had never truly thought about until she met Jack. The world they had inherited was broken, but it was theirs to fix. Every day, they worked to rebuild, to create something lasting, something that would stand the test of time. And though they had no answers to all the questions that haunted their minds, about the world outside, about other survivors, about the future. They knew one thing: they were not alone. Jack had become her partner, not just in survival, but in life. Their love had woven itself into the fabric of this new world, becoming the very heart of what they were building. It was a love born from hardship, but it had transformed into something beautiful, something worth fighting for. "Do you ever think about the world before?" Emily asked one evening, as they sat together by their small fire. "The city, the people, everything we had before?" Jack was silent for a moment, as if considering her question. "I think about it sometimes," he said finally. "But it's different now. What we have now, it's real. It's ours." Emily smiled, feeling his words settle deep within her. What they had now, what they were building together, it was real. And it was enough. A few weeks later, as the city began to feel more like a home than a forgotten relic of the past, Emily and Jack stood together, looking over their little community. There were more faces now, more people working side by side with them, planting crops, building shelters, sharing stories. It was a far cry from the empty, desolate streets they had once wandered. They had done it. They had rebuilt. But Emily knew that their work was far from over. There was still so much to do, so much more to create. But now, she didn't feel the same weight of isolation she once had. Now she felt hope, real, tangible hope. The world outside had been broken, but they had pieced together something new. They had created something worth living for. Jack wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "We've made it this far," he said softly. "And we'll keep going. Together." Emily rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his embrace. In that moment, as they looked out over the world they had built, she realized that they had done more than just survive. They had created a future, not just for themselves, but for anyone who might come.